can begin by talking about, in the broader sense, about the factors that are going to be affecting politics over the next 5 years. I'll start with you, I think, Zoe. In an election, I suppose the politicians, the parties are supposed to give us a sense of how they will be influencing politics, but of course they don't, as we found to our cost in the last 10 years, get to determine those things very often. What do you think are going to be the salient forces shaping the political landscape over the next period?
Wow, that's a really good question. Look, I mean, I think the main reason everybody's so bored by this election, the main reason everybody's so disenfranchised is that politicians treat problems as though they're unanswerable, and they actually explicitly say this problem is unanswerable. So when you talk about the housing crisis, you don't just get a lot of static in public, you get a lot of private messages saying this is not a problem that politics cannot answer anymore. And this is a real reclaim modernity thing, that modernity in their kind of conception of it is a place where politics can no longer answer those things. All it can do is kind of small technical things to alleviate the pain caused by the big tectonic shifts over which they have no control. So that's why nobody likes them. It's because it's not, I mean, I don't actually think it is because they're white and middle class and out of touch and posh. I don't even think that's the thing. I think it's because they're occupying the space where people would once have sorted these things out with a kind of immovable wall of these things can no longer be sorted out. And I think that's where the hostility comes from. So in that sense, I don't think the movements for change are going to come from engaging directly with politics. I think the movements for change are going to come from the movements around. Thank God he's nodding, because sometimes I sit next to him and he's going like this. The movements for change are going to come from engaging with the things that politics won't talk about. So that makes me think it's going to be housing, it's going to be wages. In America, when you look at what people are talking about, they always mobilise around wages. And I think that might be because their housing is cheaper. But I think these are the same things, really. That as soon as mobilisation happens around the issues which politics won't talk about, those movements become bigger than politics, and that's what I'd anticipate. So I would think that the housing stuff, and that will be like big groups like Generation Rent and very small niche groups like Cressingham Gardens, kind of building a network, which probably Aaron can tell you more about how that happens. But that's where I would expect it to come immediately after the election.
We'll definitely talk about the networks as we come round to them. Aaron, what about you? What about the forces that you expect to shape politics?
Can you hear me okay if I speak like this? Yeah? No? Don't know that? Yeah? Okay. I think the question the next 5 years is really fascinating. I think probably the bigger questions the next 15, 20 years. And I'd probably isolate 4 big changes, challenges, which I think are opportunities for people invested in radical politics. I'd say the first one is significant demographic change. Britain, Europe, the global north is going to become a lot browner. It's going to become a lot browner. This country will become a majority-minority country by 2065. 2006, the Democrats did incredibly badly in midterms. It was the nadir of the US Democrat Party. 2-term George W. Bush, people were talking about Jeb, the third member of the House of Bush. Look how far things have changed. Drug decriminalisation in Oklahoma, same-sex marriage, minimum wage campaigns across the country. A lot of that is tied up actually with these demographic changes. Latinos, blacks, becoming a more significant part of public life, simply reflecting their growth as populations within the United States. So that's one thing. Demographic change is a big one. Next one's climate change. We'll talk about that, I guess, later. But it's absolutely ginormous as an issue. It cannot be bolted on to left politics or radical politics. If the Earth's environment increases by 4 degrees C this century, that's the upper estimate, but that seems increasingly plausible, likely, probable. 2/3 of the world's major cities will be underwater. You'd see the melting of the Greenland and the Arctic ice sheets. You'd see glaciers that provide drinking water for about 2 billion people melt. The reproduction of most of the world's population would be really challenged. I don't think that means the end of capitalism, by the way. I'm not one of these. Can you get a sort of this anarcho thing on climate change? A brilliant collapse will have the end of capitalism. I don't believe that actually, but that's the second thing I'd say: climate change, demographics, and then the third one is obviously this demise of a certain economic model. And it did finish in 2008 to a certain extent. So what has finished and what has not come back? You look at, for instance, the relationship between the global north, the global south after the mid-1970s. You could repress wages in the global north because you could get ever cheaper consumer durables from the global south, China, India. Goldman Sachs executive said in 2012, there is no next China. There is no next China. Doubling of the global labour market after 1989 meant very cheap goods. You could repress wages in the global north. That had consequences for, in Marxist terms, the base, but also the superstructure. The ideology of late capitalism was about cheap consumer durables. And if they don't exist anymore, that affects the superstructure, the ideology, how they manufacture consent in the global north, as much as the base. So those are three big things, and I say the fourth is technology, but I'd leave it at that. So those are the four big variables. And so quickly, going back to the next 5 years, I think it's quite possible we'll see the beginnings of the continuation of the terminal decline, at least of one of the two major parties, probably both of them. Or at least, at best case scenario, a fragmenting. You're looking at a Labour government, I think very likely a Labour-led government after May, we're saying 7th, it's the 18th in reality, that's when Parliament's going to come back in. So they're expecting a massive palaver after May 7th. There's going to be a Labour-led government, and yet there's a 20 plus swing to the SNP north of the border. So there's not much, there's not much consent, there's not much base, not much of a mandate for a Labour government. That's not me being, critical of Labour activists or Ed Miliband. I actually think he's a pretty decent leader as it goes, but that's where we are. And so if that's the high point of Labour, getting into office and then having a 20% plus swing against them in Scotland, which by the way is bigger than any general election in the UK. Blair got a 10% swing from the Tories in 97. Attlee got a 12% swing in 45. This is unprecedented. And that's actually Labour in big trouble. And any victory next month, I think, is going to really be a sticking plaster of a very serious long-term problem to them.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Jeremy, if there's any factors you can add to that, would be great. But also, let's take a step back. We'll talk about the future of the parties and how these things will affect them. But there's a lot of these factors we're talking about, political economy, not so much climate change, that's always the endlessly, forever deferred politics that's always waiting to be grabbed, but political economy, housing, wages. These are things which have also shaped the political system we find ourselves in, the political situation we find ourselves in. Maybe you could say something also about how it came to this, particularly for Labour, how it came to that they're in the position they're in.
How we got into the situation we're in now?
Yeah.
Well, I think these two have kind of set it up quite well already, but how far back do you want me to go?
1871.
All right. Well, so I think I'll go back to the 1960s briefly. One thing I think is important in understanding the context that we're in now, and this is just supplements what you two have both said, it's not a sort of even a qualification of it in any way, is the kind of regime, the political, social and cultural regime, which has remained, mobile but stable. It's kept things changing, but it's kept class relations basically the same. Since the 1970s, emerges in response to a set of really serious democratic challenges in the 60s and 70s. That the threat that the kind of democratic social demands, which to some extent the post-war welfare state cultivated, engendered, was going to topple capitalism. It's a real live threat in the mind of people in the 70s. You look at what the elites were writing to each other. They were really scared. They really thought things like the Black Panthers were some kind of revolutionary vanguard. So partly what we've seen is a reaction, and in some sense what we've been living through 30 years of global counter-revolution. That's part of what's happened. That's part of how we got there. The other thing that's happened is, in very broad social cultural terms, is that the general complexification of culture and society since that time, especially since the because of demographic change, because of technological change, because of changes in the way people work, changes in material culture, has meant that the political system which we have, which is really inherited from the 1920s. We essentially have a system of representative government which was consolidated at the moment when women got the vote, and hasn't been changed in any significant way. really, it's completely unadapted to that situation. It was a situation. I think if you think about it in simply abstract terms, you have the party political system, the system of party political representation. It presumes that society can be divided up into these huge, relatively homogenous blocks of opinion, who can assume that by delegating to a coherent set of representatives, an entire programme of government for 5 years, that they can find themselves adequately represented. And it's a more or less plausible model during the age of mass culture, mass capital, consumer capitalism. During the era of Henry Ford's, you can have any colour you like as long as it's black. During the era when millions of people are doing very similar jobs, when any woman within a certain age is supposed to, within a very broad class range, is supposed to be a housewife, where people have these very kind of homogenous cultures. Even then, it didn't work that well, but I mean, it was relatively plausible. It's just not plausible. If you step back for a moment and think about it in abstract terms, it's not plausible that a culture as complex and as variegated and as mobile as ours, that doesn't have much more complex, much more involved, much more participatory democratic mechanisms, is actually going to be able to translate what people want into actual outcomes, into governmental outcomes. And so this is a situation in which people like Colin Crouch and myself and others have described as post-democracy. And it's been in place for a long time now. It's kind of wrong to talk about it as a crisis, because it's been like this for 30 years. So this produces a situation where, the responses on the part of political parties are to increasingly, exactly what Zoe described, to increasingly to kind of narrow down their sense of what they can do, and to see themselves not really as vehicles for the expression of the democratic will of their constituencies, but as machines for the reproduction and circulation of elites. I mean, in the case of the Labour Party, it's a huge problem. One of the single biggest problems facing the kind of organised left is that we're living now with the consequences of the professionalisation of the party at the end of the 1980s, when essentially, I'm condensing things that happened over a year or so into a tiny little caricature. But people like me got called into, when I was a student activist, got called into Walworth Road, said, "Do you want to be an MP? If you do, you've got to not have any fun for the next 5 years." And this was like the peak of rave culture. I wasn't going to. I had other things to do. And that happened to a whole cohort, really. And so the only people left were either evil or very boring. And this means that this is a really serious problem, that there isn't the talent pool in the party, in the parliamentary leaders party, even if you had the left project, there isn't anyone there to lead it. You two spend much more time than even than Aaron, certainly than me, actually interacting with people, Labour insiders, not people in general, people that's true too. Labour insiders, Labour MPs, people involved in Labour. How do they talk about the kind of stuff? Because presumably they've been presented with this narrative many times by people who are left of them. They understand how the Labour Party supposedly got to be in the place it is. So how do they talk about? No, they don't understand.
They're very aggressive. They're very aggressively self-protective, and it's really strange because you get into an argument. I'll give you an example. When Nicola Sturgeon said to Ed Miliband, "Why don't you join forces with me to make a left project against the Tories?" It was a kind of intelligent move because she was calling his bluff, but it was also, there was a possibility that she might have meant it. She might actually have thought, "Why don't we do something together to fight the ideas that we both claim to hate?" There was 5% chance that she was actually on the level. And I just said that. It wasn't the most radical thing you could have ever said. And I got lots and lots of traffic from people like Jeremy Beecham and, the left kind of very old standing, and all the Blair lot, John McTernan, that little shit. Really tearing into her voting record, tearing into me, tearing into the kind of the audacity. So it was just the audacity. How do you get the audacity to not support Labour when we know what we're doing? How do you get the stupidity to believe Nicola Sturgeon when she, remember, voted for the 19% corporation tax in 1989 in the blah branch, non-blah? Very kind of... And what was interesting to me, because I don't really care, is, they have a lot riding on me being completely stupid, and not just me, but anybody outside the Labour Party being completely stupid, and they must know that that's not true. B, they are much more allied to each other than they are to their constituents, much more allied. So if you say, if anybody kind of has a housing issue, you get a huge amount of why they're doing a brilliant job before you get any allegiance to the person with a housing issue. They've got a real party first, people second.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And Labour was first faced with the question in the 1980s, after the breakthrough of the SDP and the Liberals. Labour was faced with the question then, are you going to be a sort of ideological party, but accept that you have to be part of a kind of plurality of different actors and part of a broader alliance, or are you just going to forget about having any kind of ideological agenda and just be committed to the idea of majority Labour government at all costs?
Yeah.
And there was a very clear decision taken that it was the latter. That was the condition of possibility for New Labour. And I think in terms of kind of the internal culture of the Labour Party, I think it's something people often don't really understand, is that, historically Labour Party members, it's still the case today, and it was the case 20 years ago, they're not very ideological. Their kind of relationship to the party is a bit like their relationship to their football team. And there comes a point in which they just wanted it to win. And they're not really committed to an ideological project one way or another. So, when Blair came along and said, look, I've got a project which will persuade Murdoch to back us and will get us into power, people went along with it. I think Labour is faced with that again. I think it's faced with that choice. And I think ultimately history is forcing that choice on Labour. It's a question for Labour whether it will have to go down to 15% of the vote before it finally accepts that it can't build a political project on the basis of majority Labour government. But this has been, it's really, I think that the situation Zoe's describing is partly symptomatic of the fact that really anyone who is now a senior figure in the Labour Party was someone who made a deep and big emotional investment in choosing that route. That it's all about the party. It's not really about an ideological project. And that's why they're so hostile to Sturgeon, because Sturgeon is saying, look, what about an ideological project for social democracy, which is bigger than party? And they've made a very, very deep investment in those people in not going that route, in not doing that. So it's very, very difficult to shape that. It's very difficult.
And if you read Alistair Campbell's book, have you read it?
Yeah, some of it.
Oh my God. But he's written a book, on the eve of an election, he writes a book about winners, and he interviews all the winners he can think of. So it's like interviewing boxers, and it's really
like
weird.
Gordon Brown's book about curry.
It's super weird. It's like the end of the line for any kind of political conviction or belief. He's just interested in winning, and he's really, and you can see a lot of the DNA of modern Labour talking to him, because that's all he cares about, and it's not going to happen.
Aaron, is there anything there you want to respond to?
Not really. There's an anecdote. There are some talented people in the Labour Party. Most of them are, many of them are humourless and not particularly charismatic. But in terms of intelligence, there's a lot of people. I know a guy called Ali Mousavi, smart guy, went to the LSE, and he was working in Ed Miliband's office. Maybe he still is. I think he was one of his top policy guys. And I knew him from a long time ago. And then the student stuff kicks off in 2010. And I remember calling him the day before Day X3, the day before the big one in Westminster, on December the 9th, or maybe 2 days before. And I went, Ali, this is huge. Ed Miliband has to come. He has to make a big thing on fees. This could be the one issue he can move left on. He's going to get so much of the country. What do you think? Because we used to throw stuff about him, just chat politics. That's what we love to do. And he goes, come on, Aaron. He's Iranian British, but he has a kind of weird American drawl. And he was like, come on, Aaron, it's nonsense. You're wasting your time. What are you doing? This is ridiculous. You're an idiot, and so on and so forth. And then he goes, my God, this is on Newsnight. There's a big feature on it. This must be really important. Tell me a bit more about what's going on. And I was like, this guy, across my heart, this guy's one of the smartest people Labour had under 30. And that's how he's engaging with reality. The reality of 30,000 people on the streets without formal organisation, brokering a demo, going to Parliament Square, many of whom were kids in FE. And this is the smartest young person I met in the Labour Party saying this, there's a problem. Yeah.
We'll come back to you in a second, Mary, when we talk about change, but this is more, it's not surprising that you don't have an historical relationship with the Labour Party.
I was a member.
You were, yes, that's right.
How long for?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay.
Till 2010, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But you two, I think, do have historical relationships with this party. Jeremy, as long as I've known you, 20 years now, met you, and you've been trying to forge relationships between the intellectual left and the mainstream left and the party at various times with various degrees of intensity, all that time. But you're both talking now like you've given up. on the
I
point.
don't think I've not completely given. I mean, to be fair, in those terms, things are much better now than they have been throughout that period. I mean, it's an important point. So everyone's already gestured towards. This is the first time since 1984, there's been 31 years that the direction of travel is to the left rather than to the right from where they were before. So that is not the problem. The problem, I mean, I think Labour, and it's true, and I think the Labour manifesto is quite impressive. I think it's quite good. It's a good document. They've come up with some really good ideas that would be really serious. If they implement things like this National Investment Bank, that's a serious blow to the kind of power of finance capital. So it's a good programme. It's more that there's no way they're going to be able to implement it unless they can accept they can only really do so as part of an ecology of other, that includes other actors, that includes the Green Party and the SNP. And what I'm pessimistic about is their ability to do that. The other thing that's really changed in the past year is one of the things Aaron talked about, that I just want to underline the historical significance of. I mean, it's not only that I've been doing for 20 years, I've also been, doing like street activism and hanging around with anarchists. And depending on what audience I'm talking to, I would say something different. What I always say to the activists is, I'm sorry, but you have to accept the empirical reality that historically you don't get anywhere in this country if you don't win the argument in the Labour Party. So you don't have to win it from inside, you have to win it. And what's happened in Scotland is for the first time since the formation of the Labour Party, a kind of a left cause has essentially won something against the Labour Party, outside the Labour Party. Now that's really significant, and it does mean, and what the long-term consequences of that. I mean, nobody knows. The Labour leadership haven't got a clue what to do about it. But also the SNP, frankly, I don't think they know what to do about it either, because they have quite a big constituency of people who want them to be a kind of UK social democratic party with a special interest in Scotland. They've got others who want independence, and they want others who are just nationalists. So no one knows where that is going. But that is a historical break, and I hope they can. I hope Labour can, and I would like to see it happen. I think sooner or later Labour will do actually what I'm saying. It's just a question of whether they do it, once the vote has collapsed to the point where only Manchester and London are still voting for them.
What's your model for how that happens? Because the thing that joins all three of you on this panel is that you're all invested in one way or another with collective politics, with collective action. And with action that isn't directed from the top, isn't directed from the party. You seem not to believe in that at all anymore in your book. No. Sorry. But Jeremy, you've been thinking about these things a long time.
What would be the amount of mechanism?
How does this shift happen? Yes, okay. Exactly. What would be the mechanism?
Well, I mean, there are lots of mechanisms, and the ones that Zoe's talking about and Aaron's talking about are more important. Okay, so I'll say in a minute exactly what I think should happen in the Labour Party. But of course, I think we'd all agree. I mean, any kind of examination of the history of the 20th century shows that ultimately, what goes on in parties, what goes on in elections are really just symptoms of changes in the wider balance of forces. It doesn't really, elections tell you something about what is going on underneath them. They don't make things happen. But I think, I think that ultimately the mechanism would be the kind of success of projects like the ones Aaron's writing about, for example, the success of and the ones that Zoe's talking about, the success of some form of a social and political movement, or various forms of social political movement for sort of democratisation. Now, in terms of specifically what would have to happen around the Labour Party and the Labour leadership, is you would have to have a Labour leadership that basically accepts the account of people like me, which is that parliamentary democracy in its given form now is just incapable of delivering even the kind of socio-economic project they want. And it needs radical reform of the kind which Podemos are calling for in Spain, for example, of the kind which has been implemented in parts of Latin America, of the kind which is part of the long history of the left, going back to the 19th century. You would have to have a Labour leader who said, all right, fair enough, we get the analysis. we're not going to rebuild, we can't administer social democracy from Whitehall. And we're not, it's not unimaginable. Now, what would they then do? Well, for example, they would, do things like not laugh at Aaron when he says that they should go out and, they should, be out on the streets with the students. And I think, there is a kind of that they do get this. They get this. That's what Arnie Graf was all about, was the fact they do sort of get in principle, in theory, that they need to be part of a movement and they need to connect with movements and build movements in order to effectuate social change. But
I'm going to come to Aaron to talk about social movements in a second, but Zoe, first of all, in your book, there's a tension, I think, that runs all the way through the book when you're talking about the we and how we get it together. Sometimes it feels like you're talking about working around the state and around the party apparatus. I think with healthcare, you think there are possibilities for collective action there. With housing, not so much. You're very pessimistic about the possibility of anything happening there unless there are decisions made by those in power. But how did you come out of this project thinking about how change happens?
I mean, I'm not actually pessimistic. It's really weird. A lot of whenever I go to anything or anybody reads anything I've done, they always say they're depressed. Whereas I think I've really cheered them up. So I'm obviously there's something I'm not getting across. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm not pessimistic about the housing thing. My kind of abiding feeling is that we've been here before. We've been in a situation where very few people owned all the land and nobody had anything they could do about it before. We were in this situation at the end of the 19th century. So the idea that we don't have the ingenuity to get out of it collectively, I wouldn't hold with at all. The problem with the party structure, which I always find, if everybody in the Labour Party was a complete dick, then you could just move on. The problem with them is some of them are really deep thinking people. And so and it's their tension in a way that kind of stifles what you're doing, because for every Rachel Reeves, there's an Alison McGovern. For every Liam Byrne, there's a Lisa Nandy. And you always think, well, maybe I can go this far with you, and then you remember why you can't. The question we're really asking here, which I often don't realise is being asked until I realise, is, are we looking for a new party or are we looking for a takeover of this party? And my feeling is that it doesn't hugely matter, because the momentum isn't going to come from the leader anyway. The momentum isn't going to come from the person the kind of messianic figure anyway. So whether it's the leader of the Labour Party or we decide to have a UK Podemos, I'm not sure how much that matters.
Aaron, where is change going to come from, if it's going to come?
Yeah. Well, I agree with Zoe in terms of it's not. I don't think that's the central question. Do we need a new party? I think Jeremy's right that Labour is never going to govern ever again, probably by majority in the UK. That's a big claim. You think about it. I can't really see it happening again. So any government moving forward, and I think further devolution's likely. That could extend to various parts of England, federalism, etc. Who knows what West Lothian question be resolved, etc., etc. But I think that's a fair claim. And so, yeah, I agree that that's not the central question of do we start a new party together. I think probably both will happen, right? I think the Greens will do incredibly well. I think the Greens are going to get maybe 4 or 5 second places this time, maybe 10, 15 in 5 years' time. That's a really good launch pad as Labour kind of crumbles to get a real base of seats. Looking 2025, that's the long game. You talk to smart Green Party activist Adam Ramsey. He's talking 10, 15 years. He's not talking next month.
Yep.
And I think that's interesting because you don't get many people in Labour talking in those terms, actually.
They're really scared.
Yeah, so I think how do we get all one? I think so. My area of scholarship is interested in, or was interested in, it's over now, thankfully, is interested in about the intersection between social movements, technology, party politics. If you look at the United States, what's happened in the last 10 years, great scholar, a guy called Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, wrote a book called Ground Wars, Personalised Communications. And he says it's not about big party machines with loads of resources winning these races anymore. It's about what he calls kind of, I know this sounds very flaky, but there's some good empirical work behind it. Electoral assemblages, which include, various interest groups, highly connected, networked individuals. Look at Owen Jones. This guy's got 250,000 followers on Twitter. This guy is in him as a resource. That's really significant. So
how can we monetize him?
Well, he's doing very well. Penguin have found a way. But if you think about the ontology of the kinds of assemblages that get behind single issue campaigns, etc. And I think the single big takeaway from the emergence of the digital environment is this, which is that actually organisational possibilities for political endeavours are expanding at every level. So it's not about, we need this one organisation, it's going to do everything. If you want to get rid of page 3, maybe you need a blog, a Twitter hashtag, one full-time press officer. Do you know what I mean? And that's an organisational form appropriate to that endeavour. Then there's another endeavour. How do we get out of the EU? There are very, and I think what the digital environment does is expands the kinds of actors which are appropriate to kind of the multiplicity, the infinity of endeavours that humans try to undertake collectively.
I mean, but my problem, I mean, I agree with you, and I've heard really good arguments for why, an online union, which you don't even have to have a job to join, is going to be like massive force for good and force for change. My problem with
I don't think that's a good idea. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, no, but well, tell me why not, because otherwise I'll just keep on peddling it. My problem with the kind of mobilising around a single issue is that, it is, you're exactly right, it's really, really effective. The problem is that a lot of the circumstances that create the issues are the same organised thing. So the same organised financialisation is screwing up the health service at the same time as the housing market, at the same time as outsourcing, at the same time as so you've got an organised force coming from here, and the single issues seems to concede the issues it doesn't really care about, and you need something much more coordinated to do the big stuff.
I mean, I'll just clarify what I said. I mean, it's not just single issue campaigns, right? So if you think the two big spin doctors of the two parties, they're not even in these parties. Linton Crosby and David Axelrod. They're not even British. One's Australian, the Lizard of Oz, one's an American. So if you're thinking about how have election campaigns changed, it's not about drawing on the resources of some mass membership party. No. It's about Blue State Digital, Linton Crosby, these activists, these celebrities, and it's about creating assemblages around. In this context, obviously, the objective is to form a majority in Parliament, but that could be a multiplicity of things, and that's what I'm saying. So. The kind of ontology of political parties and their relation to achieving things. And it's not just about campaigns is one element, right? Mm-hmm. But then, big money consultants, celebrities.
Would you agree that you need to, you can find a kind of a multiplicity of ways to do things that an old school party would have done, but there's something about the old school party presenting a large scale opposition to a large enemy that actually we can't patch together.
I don't know. I mean, empirically, there's just no example of it. I mean, maybe the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, they didn't do too well, right? As a mass membership organisation. I mean, there's no in the global north. There's no empirical example of that. I mean, I'm not familiar with Latin America, okay. But I mean, that's my inclination.
There's a question which is moving between the both of you here about how, say, single issue campaigns or small groups or hubs or whatever kind. How a broader movement or an electoral movement, a mass movement of any kind emerges, coalesces from that kind of action. Do you have a model for thinking about how that happens? Because after all, what you're all looking for really is a transformation of mass consciousness. That's the only thing that's going to do this in the end. Yeah. How does that,
I think that's
even theoretically,
5 minutes away,
get going?
Well, there is a model in Podemos. Yeah. I mean, Podemos is the model of that happening. I mean, the conditions
Doesn't
are
it
different.
require crisis of a much more pronounced kind than even we've experienced?
Yeah, it may well do.
Somebody said about Podemos, this geographer said that the crisis, what was so successful about the crisis was that it was really it really worked across the classes. So it went right up into kind of repossessions at a kind of upper middle class level. And I think that's what we've got in common, right? Everybody's going to be screwed by the same mechanism eventually.
Well, I mean, Paul's raised the question, and I think, when I was making my notes for today, one of the things I was going to say, the single biggest danger for the left is that this won't happen, and that nothing much is going to change at the next election or for the foreseeable future. I think, my answer to your initial question, actually, what are the processes driving things? Well, the biggest one is just capitalism. Capitalism is not as a structure, but as a process, as the process of financial elites trying to keep accumulating capital and hold on to their position. Mm. And I think, they've really done well. They've really played it well the past 5 years. They got everybody absolutely terrible. Remember 5 years ago, we were told there was going to be 4 million unemployed. Like the level of austerity that was threatened was much worse than what's actually happened, which has made them able to get away with some evil, punitive attacks on some of the most vulnerable sections of the population. But broadly speaking, it hasn't really provoked. It hasn't provoked the level of resistance that we would like. And I think the biggest danger for us is that just carries on. I think on the other hand, I would say, I think it's always an analytical mistake. I think to think that it's the experience, it's suffering that really radicalizes people. I don't think it is. It wasn't the crisis really that produced Podemos. It was the movement that came out of it. Yeah. There are plenty of places there's been crises like that. The movements that haven't arisen. It's the experience of empowerment. It's the experience of their own collective potential that actually radicalises people. And I think, some of the things Aaron's talking about, I think to me speak to, there's a much broader situation in which people do have actually, we all do, everybody who spends, hours on Facebook has a certain experience of kind of collective assemblage and creative collaboration and in this new context. And I think we don't know whether that stuff can be activated, whether all that that can be turned into a kind of a form of radical consciousness. We don't yet know because hardly anybody has really tried, and certainly in contexts like Britain we haven't much tried. But I think, it could be. I also think we don't know what the tipping point is going to be with the just complete lack of legitimacy in the democratic system in this country, which we've all talked about and we all acknowledged. There might not be one. It might be that people sort of continue to accept, what I call the post-democratic neoliberal settlement. Because we all know we don't really have democracy anymore. And we all know, and nobody really wanted the privatisation of the railways. Nobody even really wanted the privatisation of British gas, never mind everything subsequent. But as long as homeowners, which is still a majority of the population, get treated like kings, and just get everything they want and get to, spend up, get loads of cheap holidays and virtually get paid to live in a house, which is... then we just keep going along with it. That might be the case, or there might be a tipping point. There might be a point at which the fact that we're just not represented, that we just don't have any say in any of this stuff anymore, and it's becoming increasingly transparent that no matter who we vote for, they're going to do the same thing they were going to do anyway. Yeah. There might well be a tipping point, and that would be the kind of crisis, and it wouldn't be just an experience of deprivation. It would be a kind of mismatch between the sense of potency that we all experience in some aspect of this digitized environment, and the fact that potency doesn't have any form of expression at the level of government and politics. And that could happen. Neil Lawson keeps saying this. I think he's right. Really, that could happen at any moment. It could, and it wouldn't be that surprising.
You sound like a gnome.
Aaron, I think you wanted to.
I don't know. But go on. Yeah, please.
Very, very, very quickly. You could say Podemos gets its activist base from the 15M, the 15M movement, a movement that starts on May 15th in Spain, 1 week before a general election. That was organised. The 15M was organised by 25 activists. January 2011, you've got several small groups, mostly net-based, no bricks and mortar presence, no full-time membership, very little money. And I think the digital environment allows... The thing is, when a technology is so mundane, it's difficult to discern what has it changed. And I think something like the 15M was impossible without the digital environment. And that's one thing. And then I want to say a second point, which is you're saying about, the crisis over here wasn't as bad as it was in Spain and Italy. It's bad in Italy, but Spain and Greece. Yeah. If you look at... so the big sort of... What do you see? What's the crisis? How does it manifest itself in Southern Europe? Unemployment, specifically youth unemployment, right? Here it's massive wage repression. People in their 20s, on an hourly basis, have seen wages fall by 12% since 2010. Yeah. We'll raise a median household income.
I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying I think there's so far they've got away with that. Yeah. They've got away with that.
You don't need to lay people off if you've got declining wages, and that's the way we've had stagnant productivity since 2008. There's no model for that in the world where that's meant to happen, and I think that's actually more frightening for a capitalist. In terms of the reproduction of capital, stagnant productivity is a lot more worrying than high unemployment. You go, this is a big problem. If you're like a Deutsche Bank economist, you don't give a fuck. Sorry, excuse my French. You don't care less about high unemployment. It's good, fantastic. We'll keep wages down.
It's really interesting you should say it, because Rosie Rogers said, she's at Greenpeace now, but she used to be at Compass, and she said, even people I know, she's like 27, I think. She said, even people I know who aren't political at all are really, really angry. And I thought, that's quite interesting, because when I was 27, people who weren't political weren't angry. They were all taking E. They weren't angry. But there was a kind of, I think exactly as you say, the wage repression and the housing situation for people under 30 is accelerating towards badness much faster than the commentariat realises, certainly. And when you say this in The Guardian, you do get treated like a bit of a freak.
I hope that's true. But I think 5 years ago, everybody was saying this is definitely all going to blow up before the next election, and it hasn't done. And I think the extent to it, I think we mustn't underestimate their capacity to manage this situation. And I think that's the real. I say you're right, but I think I'm very worried when I hear people say. Oh, they're going to take back. They're going to cut back welfare spending to the 1930s levels. I mean, they're clearly not going to do that. They're going to say they're going to do that to impress the bond markets, but they're not going to do it partly because that would reduce productivity even more for those reasons. And I think they do put us in a very difficult position. This is one of the very clever moves they played, like the right in this country. It does put us in a very difficult position because if we say, oh, it's all going to be terrible, and then it isn't as bad as we said it was going to be, then we look stupid. And if we don't say it's all going to be terrible, then we just induce complacency. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't have a pat answer.
It's constant. I'm constantly finessed by them because they often catastrophize the situation as it stands, and the only way to resist the change, whether it's academisation and free schools or privatisation of the NHS, the only way to resist their agenda is to say it's actually not that bad. And that is like nobody joins a rallying cry of it's actually not that bad, even when it's not.
Does a progressive politics in the short term have to be an anti-capitalist politics?
Yes. It doesn't have to be anti-business. I think the left historically is faced with a kind of a strategic dilemma that we don't know we haven't even begun to address. In that both Marxism and Fabian socialism shared the assumption that the petty bourgeois was going to have disappeared by the end of the 20th century. So it didn't matter that they were hegemonized by the right consistently. Actually, what's happened is the petty bourgeois has both expanded and its culture has changed. And the only people who've really tried to recruit them have been the neoliberals. Arguably, initially, I've sort of done academic work on this. So it's you could say the emergence of sort of knowledge workers as a kind of new, I'm not going to say in Marxist terms they're not a new class, but they're a kind of a new sort of section of the economy at sort of the end of the 60s. Initially is kind of part of the impetus for things like 1968. Initially it gives rise to these expansive democratic demands. And the argument made by people like Boltanski and Capello, which is quite persuasive, is actually the shift to a capitalism of high levels of individualism, of consumerism, of post-Fordism is partly an attempt to kind of capture those desires and to recruit that strategically crucial section. So I think we probably have to find a language and an analysis which makes a much clearer distinction between the kind of commercial activity, which the sort of petty bourgeois historically engage in, and they still engage in, and capitalism proper, capital accumulation. I think we really, Ed sort of had a go at that a bit with the stuff around predators and things, but I think we could be much clearer. And I think we have to be quite open-minded about what forms of economic activity might be good, might be socially productive, might be innovative, might be creative, and absolutely implacable that there are big organisations whose only end is capital accumulation are always destructive, always. There's no kind of two ways about that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I've got nothing against capitalism in the sense of investing a capital amount in a productive thing and then either losing it if it doesn't happen or not losing it if it does happen. I've got nothing against civic capitalism, and that's where I often part ways with my fellow travellers, because I don't, I think the left often shuts itself off kind of financial people who are kind of financially innovative in a kind of peer-to-peer way and in the crowdfunding way, and there's a kind of inherent distrust, certainly in the Labour Party actually, and in the Green Party, there's a real distrust of anybody who has any profit motive. There's the real distrust of anybody who has a kind of separation of capital and productivity. So, even the act of saying, well, I've got the capital and you've got the idea is in itself untrustworthy. And I don't agree with all that.
Aaron?
I think if you were to say who are the most important people to persuade globally in terms of a new global political economy, I'd say the two most important groups are Chinese working class, East Asian working class, and Silicon Valley. And if they change their minds, anything's possible, right? If you look at someone like Elon Musk, founder of eBay, Tesla Motors, this guy's the CEO of the biggest solar energy company in the world, and it's just unbelievable, sort of, Da Vinci of the 21st century. And if you could start saying to people like that, look, the dreams, the aspirations you have, the objectives you have are only really plausible, if we're being honest, in a post-capitalist society, right? I think that's where you are looking at quite interesting propositions. And I think the problem is for most people older than myself, I'm not, that's just the historical norm. There was the USSR, there's this shadow. When we talk about communism, people think turnips, they think scarcity, they think poverty, right? But if you're saying, look, the whole point of communism was the abolition of exchange value, it's moving to a post-scarcity society, that's where a lot of hooked, like very joined up thinking with Silicon Valley, West Coast kind of entrepreneurial kind of rhetoric. I think it's interesting, right? Because when they talk about why they do what they do, it's almost always about flourishing, their personal flourishing, and about facilitating the flourishing of others, what Marx called organic living labour. They are not interested about a society about selling your labour onto a market, working. And I think there's an interesting possibility there. And I think, if you were to say, Aaron, if you could address any one group, it'd be a toss-up between the Chinese working class and Silicon Valley sort of tech CEOs, sort of PhDs from IT and so on.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analysis. I always say to my students, look, in the post-socialist utopia, we're probably still going to let Steve Jobs live in a golden palace, but like he's going to be, we're just not going to let Wall Street like harvest all the profits that he generates. I think that's completely right. And I think in sort of Gramscian terms, we're in a context, it happened since the end of the 90s, arguably for the first time, there is a global hegemonic historic bloc. But Gramsci uses the term historic bloc, which is a kind of coalition of class fractions. And the key class fractions, as I put it, are big tech, Silicon Valley, and finance capital, and venture capital. And if you could disaggregate that, you're right. If you could disaggregate the kind of parasitic element of that, which is finance capital, from the really creative element, which is which is Silicon Valley, then you would really be onto something. I think I think that's right. And you're right about the Chinese working class being the other constituency, because that's, in some ways, what happens there is the thing. Again, this is something I've been saying to students for years. In the end, our fates are all going to be decided by how quickly the Chinese unionise and at what point they decide they're not going to work. Well, they're not going to work for £1 a day making iPhones for us
wages
anymore.
in China have gone from 400 or 500% since 2000. They're going up every year. The last couple of years, 11%, 12% year on year. And you're saying about people paid to sit at home, those cheap durables they're buying, those cheap holidays, that whole superstructure is based, yes, on cheap petroleum, which has come back. None of us saw that happening.
Yeah, but cheap labour, you're right.
And cheap labour, right, which
yeah.
is definitely not coming back. And there's the next China. They were saying Vietnam, they were talking Bangladesh. Bangladesh industrial action in Bangladesh 2 years ago was phenomenal. It was incredible, And so if you're a capitalist, you're saying, well, where do we go next? Vietnam, Bangladesh, not looking so great anymore. And there's not... 1989, doubling of the global labour market, the Eastern Bloc, China, India. China has 2.6 billion people. You want to repress wages? That's pretty good, right? That's a one-off. And that's the thing, sometimes we talk to unintelligent advocates of free markets, and you say, well, look, this is not happening. And they just don't really have an answer. They say, like, reshoring or something.
Then they say robots.
Yeah, robots.
Yeah, robots.
Then nobody's buying the durables anymore because they're unemployed,
This is what's interesting about the analysis you're producing there, because Jeremy puts it in terms of the future for the left of being the disaggregation of technology and capital. Well, the solution to climate change for capitalists would be precisely technology, but maintaining that link, right?
I mean, the climate change. There's so much. I think the first problem for climate change is going to be figuring out how to have that conversation without it immediately becoming climate change versus equality, because at the moment that goes really, really fast. 1 minute everybody's on the same page, the next minute you're on two completely different pages, and I don't think that tension really exists. I think that all the effort put into protecting very small, very wealthy communities from the ravages of climate change are so manifest that the drive towards greater equality is kind of unhitchable from the drive towards kind of climate change action. But that's an argument that happens again and again and again. I agree with Aaron in the sense that I think crises are going to happen much faster than, well, no, actually not faster than we foresaw, but maybe certainly faster than I kind of took into my vision of the future. And you are going to get these crises of kind of, huge migrant deaths and huge migration. And that's already having a massive effect on the way we talk about human rights and human dignity and human value. And I think if we can't clear that hump it's going to start. The problem is going to start to be what the point of the left is if it can't articulate these basic things about the value of human life. And that, I think, is quite urgent now. I don't think that's happening anything like fast enough.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, of course.
the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre estimates between 150 million, 300 million climate refugees by 2050.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's just unbelievable.
and that's another factor we talk about, changing the demographics of Europe becoming browner.
Yeah.
You think sub-Saharan Africa, crop yields are going to decline by 1/3 because of climate change. Its population is going to double by 2050, right? So you've got one continent, it's got these crunches, maybe security crunches, the end of American empire. Problems with water, Sanaa, first city in the world in Yemen. It's going to run out of water in 2017. Half the population is under 15 years old. Right? Where do you think those people go? You know, right? And they may go to neighbouring countries which are unstable. I'm not saying that as some racist or orientalist. I'm half Iranian. There are Iran and Turkey, the two stable countries in the region. Nowhere else is. So where do those people go? They're going to go to Europe. And unless the European Union, like you said, challenges actually, I think, the fundamental post-war discourse on rights. Because unless Europe has a joined-up kind of program about what it's going to do specifically with regards to climate change refugees, and that's aligning amazingly with the collapse of American empire, then I mean it's catastrophe. I mean, the stuff we're seeing right now, it was 900 deaths last Sunday, wasn't it? Yeah. The most recorded deaths of undocumented migrants in the Mediterranean in living memory. That's going to become a daily event, really. And I don't think that's to say that people are scaremonger. I don't think that is actually. That's quite conservative to start saying those kinds of things. Ethiopia by 2050 is over 200 million people. Nigeria, over 400 million people. These are huge numbers. Europe did this 150 years ago. Yeah. And it took us colonising the rest of the world, taking our surplus populations there, taking their resources. How do you do it in a world where it doesn't seem plausible. The whole thing about how does the world support 10 billion people under capitalism, it doesn't. It's simple as that, That's not an ideological claim, it's a...
I knew we'd reach apocalypse sooner or later.
No.
It's a good moment, though, to open things up to the audience. We'll see how many questions there are, and we'll take them either singly or in groups. There's one in the front here. Wait for the microphone, and then... Here we go.
Okay, thanks. Moving away from the last really bleak moments, I wonder if the panel doesn't see more hope in the domestic political system. I mean, in the aggregate, if you think back to the 19th century, from 1832 to 1918, I mean, it was a long, slow but transformation under the pressure of contingencies. All we've been talking about are contingencies that are going to bear in on the system. So the system has a historic record of transformation. Multi-party model is out there. I watched... Andrew Marr last Sunday, I think, what's his name, Miliband ducked and weaved on the question of his alliance with Sturgeon. So, I mean, it was a very pessimistic take from the panel, but I wonder if there isn't room for a little bit more optimism. And then coming to Aaron's point, I mean, I was just jotting down here the single issue movements and the variety of them just in the last few years. Gay marriage, Margaret Hodge on tax change, plain cigarette packaging, the Scottish mobilisation, and then 38 Degrees, one's Forest campaign, NHS campaign, all of them successful, all of them bearing out your point. There's a lot of underlying potentials in the system, so I guess I'm trying to...
Well, reasons for optimism, in a sense, is the broadest question. Where should we start with that? Where do you start, Jeremy?
I think we did articulate a lot of reasons for optimism. I think it's a highly unstable system. We're in a far from equilibrium system, and this stuff could change at any time. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's true. I mean, the Labour manifesto includes a constitutional convention, partly because they listen to people like me banging on about how the system's completely broken. And it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. It's perfectly possible. It's possible, and it is possible that. The SNP are just going to force them to accept a kind of pluralist system. So at the moment it's completely unknowable. But I think, I'm not pessimistic in the long term. I never am. I think these things. But I think I have to be honest. Like in the short, right now. Either at the kind of cultural level or the political level, we don't see the scale of mobilisation that builds up, that historically builds up to the kind of thing you're talking about. It might start tomorrow, and we're all going to keep trying to make it start. I think the examples are really good. I mean, the example, if you're talking about things, I mean, like the relationship between democratic reform, technological change, and workers' movements. I mean, you can think about the history that leads from the Chartists to, right up to 1945. But that's 150 years nearly. I think that will be accelerated by the new technology. But I think, in all probability, we're in a relatively early stage of a kind of historical phase that begins with the cybernetic revolution in the 50s and 60s, which initially has enabled, the capitalist class to re-entrench power it was in danger of losing. And I don't know how long it will take us to develop the forms of organisation necessary to kind of re-establish democracy as a kind of, I don't know how long it will take. And you're right, there are all kinds of reasons to think it might happen very, very soon. The historical precedent suggests it might take quite a long time. So, but yeah, it might well. It might well. It's not like it's not like I'm going to stop trying. It's not like I'm going to leave the Labour Party anytime soon. I don't. So it's not like And I think you're right. I mean, it's true. Well, also, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. For the first time since 1984, the Labour leadership is moving leftwards, not moving rightwards. And that's the first time it's in 31 years that you can say that's true. Well, maybe you could have said it for the past 3 years. So, but it's the first time in 30 years that the Labour Party leadership. I mean, New Labour, people forget. Right? New Labour wasn't just right wing from the beginning. It started off really right wing, and it got more and more right wing. So, like Labour, so I think that is. I mean, if there is something to be optimistic about in terms of the local political context, it is that. And I think. I'll leave it at that.
Zoe.
I mean, my anxiety about things like Margaret Hodge, my anxiety about the gay wedding thing as a kind of sign of positive change is that I think you're often given these concessions which seem really, really incredible, but they make no actual incursions into the way power is moving. And I don't think gay marriage does make any incursions into the way power is moving. And I think a lot of identity issues are the same. I don't think equal pay really made any it made women's lives better, but it didn't actually change the direction of travel. So I would then the kind of the ancillary problem to that is that you take them as wins, and then it kind of takes the wind out of your sails, because you think so the tax evasion issue, you think, well, Margaret Hodge is talking about it in this way, which nobody ever used to talk about it. And businesses, when you talk to them now, say it's not the same as it was 10 years ago. We're not trying to avoid every single bit of tax. Some tax we think we should pay. And somehow the kind of change of temperature makes you think that that's as far as you're going to get. And it's actually, and nothing really that significant has changed in the kind of amounts of tax that are paid by the various groups of society that pay them. So that's the downside. I'm really optimistic, because historically, movements can be traced to over 150 years, but all the movements that we're talking about, the SNP, Podemos, Syriza, they happened in a year. The SNP got that surge a year from when the kind of radical independence of Scotland and Commonweal started. Podemos happened in a year. They were having their gatherings in 2011, but they didn't set up as a party until end of 2013. So I think actually, something might change, and we might look back and say this change was seeded in 1979, or this change was seeded in the 50s. But it's still, when it happens, will happen really fast.
Aaron, reasons for optimism?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, despite the final comment, I am very optimistic. It's a huge challenge, which I actually do think that the global north will meet. Actually, I just don't think that's going to happen. I think it would fly in the face of 400 or 500 years of reasonable progress with regards to the formation of a humanist culture. I don't think that can't happen, right? Simple as that. I was going to say, with regards to, the Conservative Party haven't won a majority. Everybody knows this, right? The Conservative Party haven't won a majority in this country since 1992. The Democrats, in terms of actual votes, have won 5 of the last 6 elections in the US. If you think about the kind of overall trajectory of politics just in the mainstream, something really significant has changed. If you look at the Republicans now, you've got a US election in 2016, because you're saying about, look, we've got movements to the left of the Labour Party, and we've got the most left-leaning Labour leader in living memory, right? Well, since, let's say, Michael Foot. Yeah, Michael Foot, right? And actually, you've got a very similar dynamic going on in the United States right now. Barack Obama, yes, he didn't close Guantanamo. Yes, there are drone strikes in Yemen. But this is the most liberal Democrat leader since, I don't know, let's say Jimmy Carter or something, right? Long time. And yet he's being outflanked on the left of his own party now by somebody like, say, Liz Warren. Don't write her off, by the way. Don't write her off. Bill de Blasio in New York. You almost got Troy Garcia, almost won in Chicago. Almost beat Rahm Emanuel. This guy was the insider of the Democrat Party. He was Mr. Insider, mayor 1%, almost lost, right? He didn't lose because black Chicagoans didn't vote for a Latino. That's why he didn't lose, which is a tragedy in itself, right? So those dynamics actually go beyond just Britain, which I think make them particularly interesting. Your point about single issue, I think that's the thing, right? Again, is that the mundanity of something. It's so often, so frequent that you just take it for granted. I absolutely agree with you. Another one is Stella Creasy on payday lending. Payday lending, and just all of a sudden everybody's like, yeah, we can't do this anymore. And while I agree there are limits to that, I think that's a new dynamic, and I think that's new, that's going to only grow. And then finally, to build on what you said in terms of that's limited, if I think about the stuff that Navarra is involved in, it's still a very small project and so on, but it's about the intersection of media, politics, collective action, and it's about how do you, the kinds of these single issue things or new parties, how do you infuse them with a kind of protocol or a set of ideas which are beyond this? And I think that's actually the fundamental question that intellectuals should be asking of themselves. Speaking of Adam Ramsey, he said that Young Greens, there's 17,700 Young Greens now, more than the Labour students, which is just amazing. You think about students organising an anti-fees demo now. Young Greens are a really big organisation. He said the Young Greens, they have 3 news sources. He said they have Vice, Open Democracy and Navarra. I was like, great. And he said they're doing this big thing on fully automated luxury communism. He said they're all talking about this is fantastic, this is wonderful, right?
What is fully automated?
Well, good question.
What it says on the tin.
Good question. And so I think that's a really important thing. So you've got, you're saying reasons for opportunity, optimism. On the one hand, you say there's challenges, really huge challenges. What Cloud and Peven, 2 big scholars of social movements in the 1960s would call them, they'd say this is the political opportunity structure. These are opportunities. And actually left movements or progressive movements always respond to the opportunity structure. So why do you have the SNP in Scotland? Why don't you have something like that in England? And of course, a lot of kind of really stupid analysis goes, well, English people are stupid, English people are racist. That's obviously not true. It's not true. That's just not true. The reason is, in Scotland, you have a devolved parliament. There are lower costs of entry to a new form, a new organisation getting some kind of foothold in there. Or you look at, for instance, the rise of Podemos or Syriza, it's because they don't have first past the post elections. So that opportunity structure is really, really, really significant. So when we talk about problems, I think we should be talking about opportunities. Going back to my initial point about the 4 things that are going to define the next century. If the left doesn't meet them, if the Labour Party isn't going to talk about demographic transformation in this country, in Europe, if it's not going to talk, it's an irrelevant organisation. That's not to sort of be blasé and just dismiss them. Because I think these are 4 trends that are so crucial to where our species is going in the next 50 years that we have to meet them. And if we don't, we're irrelevant. And then you see ground to the far right, although thankfully that's not really happening in many places.
Okay, questions. We've got 3 here. I'll take the gentleman over there by the bookshelf.
Thanks. I wrote a note so I could look reasonably articulate. In between tweeting and listening, I wrote a note. Aaron, firstly, I'm glad you began to flesh out your fully automated luxury communism. Before you even referenced it, you sort of began to flesh it out. I'm going to make a really quick point because it leads up to my question. I've put in a neoliberal financialised economy. The accumulation of capital, I think, is really based on the accumulation of debt by lots of people. So I think debt is the big thing. Unsecured debt rising at 1.25 billion a month, right? That's unsecured, not against an asset. Against an asset is even worse. And the government's Help to Buy scheme is basically, an asset inflation scheme. So debt is the big thing, and financialisation is the big thing. So I think maybe the tipping point might come, if we're looking for some sort of tipping point, might be the point at which a financialised demographic, students as well, of course, I work in a university, students are financialised. The tipping point might come whereby the working class, middle class can't meet their debt obligation, and I think, as Aditya said on your show a few months ago, if interest rates go up 2%, 1.5%, 2%, loads of people can't meet their debt obligations, can't reproduce their own labour power. I think that might be the point. So I don't know whether the question is the extent to which debt might be the tipping point.
Let me add something to that question while we're on the subject. I mean,
Yes, you may.
do you know what I mean? In your book, you used the women's movement of the 1970s as a way of thinking about a model for the emergence of a collective politics. And we've heard, and obviously the woman is the subject of that political movement. We've heard various candidates for political subjects now. The graduate without a future is one of them. The indebted subject is another. What is the potential for organising around? What are the limits and possibilities of organising a politics around that idea?
Well, I think those are all good ideas. I mean, the political subject is always constructed. It's never just given. I think the crucial thing for me in thinking about, well, how do you construct those kind of political communities and collectivities that make a difference, is that ultimately the ones that really make a difference are always based around concrete interest of some kind. I think even the women's movement, when it's potent, is when it has a sense of, well, women's shared interests, rather than just being a question of identity. People really hate me saying this when I say it's not about identity, it's about interests. I think that's why the notion of class historically has been so important, although actually strategically, I mean, it's one of the big sort of aporias of Marxism. If you go looking for an empirical example of a successful socialist movement that actually was using the language of international class struggle rather than some kind of national community to mobilise itself, it's going to keep disappearing. Even in Russia, it was very quickly became a patriotic struggle. I think you have to find communities of interest. I think having said that about class, I do think. From my position would be that one of the invariant features of capitalism is that unless people are mobilised, at least around, they can be mobilised around other things as well, but unless they're mobilised around the politicisation of work and relations of work, you can't get anywhere. So we do need some kind of whether it's an online union or whether it's something else, we desperately need to think about what a 21st century effective labour movement will look like and how that will be. So the idea of mobilising the workers, partly I'm saying it's still about mobilising the workers, because as long as most people live through selling their wage labour primarily, that's going to be an issue. I think there's other communities of interests that could really be mobilised successfully. I think clearly we see it in the election now with the fact that Labour's hopes of winning the election are all about people's investment in the NHS. I think we could go much further in mobilising people's kind of collective interest as users of public services. I think the reason that isn't happening in an imaginative way is because to do that, what you have to do is you have to have a real programme, a real alternative to the neoliberal approach to public services. And the only really inspiring alternative to that would be a genuine programme for the democratisation, the mutualisation and democratisation of public services, which is something the New Left wanted from the early 60s. I think there's clearly real scope for that. I think the scope around debt, I think the scope around precarity. But I think it's also worth keeping, it's worth keeping in mind that, to some extent, there's always, people like Leclerc or Shay, there's always, although on the one hand, successful movements, progressive movements are always grounded in these specific sets of interests, there's always a kind of tendency, a kind of movement towards a horizon of universalisation. So the sense that, we are the 99%, we are the people, we are everywhere, we are everyone, almost everyone, apart from this tiny handful of people who accumulate to the government, also crucially has to be part of it. That kind of sort of will to universalisation, I think, is really important. And I think, which is one of the problems with the kind of tendency. There's a huge tendency at the moment. I mean, the dominant tendency on the kind of soft left, the kind of the world that me and Zoe spend a lot of time in, especially, is that this idea that it's all about localization now. It's all about localism. It's all about devolution. Which probably is, I keep saying to people, what is it you think you're going to devolve? Westminster isn't holding on to all the power. They gave it all to PricewaterhouseCoopers. They didn't. What is it they think they're going to? It's not. And I think that what that speaks to, and what is the problem of how you actually constitute forms of power. And I think this is really. I said this about the last government. I mean, I said that I think with New Labour, I said this sort of 10 years ago, but I think the left made strategically got it all wrong most of the time in New Labour. So we complained about New Labour not doing things that the balance of forces was never going to allow them to do. You know, they weren't going to just come into power and suddenly start spending loads of money on public services and taxing people. I mean, they didn't have a mandate to do that. The balance of forces was never going to allow it. But what we should have expected of them after 10 years of Labour government is they should have done three things. I say this all the time: rebuild the Labour movement, rebuild local government. I don't mean devolve power to it. I mean create communities of power in localities. And for God's sake, take advantage of the digital revolution to fuck Murdoch. You know, do it. You know, they could have done it. They could have built. Sorry, again, excuse language, but they could have done it. They could have built They could have built a whole alternative media sector. And so, what have we got? You know, Novara is fantastic. But it's also kind of incredible that Novara is like the only thing like Novara. You know, Novara, in the 60s, the Wilson government would have been throwing money at Novara. And this is the demand we have to make. The demand we have to make, if there is a progressive government, we have to make the demand that they do things whose objective is to change the balance of forces, so that the empowered collective political subjects of the kind you're asking about are facilitated. They can't make them come from nowhere, but they can help, and that I think has to be the key demand ultimately.
It's weird, isn't it? You say that because it was a real failure of the imagination rather than a failure of mandate with the Labour Party, because they devolved kind of technical power but no money. So then when this government came in, they were able to instantly choke off 40% of the money to local government and then say, what, you've got all the power, this is your problem. So it was really a really smart, it was a really stupid of the Labour Party, but I don't think it was actually, I don't think they were thinking, how do we dodge our left-wing duties? I think they were just not thinking. But that's well, I think they'd been completely convinced that they didn't want to do it. I mean, the core people around New Labour had been convinced by the neoliberal narrative that the people who know how to run the world are finance capitalists, and you should let them do it. Well, so then why would you pay even lip service to devolving to local authorities? Which should they do?
Because it was a way of doing that. Because it was a way of what they actually did. They devolved responsibilities, but they dissolved them to kind of networks of quangos and outsourced companies. It was a way of financialising. It was a way of actually handing over power to the finance capitalists who, I mean, Brown became, I think, genuinely convinced they know how to run things, and other people don't, and people don't.
I mean, on the matter of debt, I think the weirdly interesting thing is that there's more shame around. There's a real shame around debt. There's more shame around debt than there is even around being a woman, and that's saying something. So if you can build a women's movement, you can build a debt movement. And no, sorry, that contradicts me completely. But I think you can actually, I think once you if you do take that leap and say, I'm not ashamed, this is a debt, but I'm not ashamed of it, and I didn't enter into it willingly, and I didn't have an alternative, and I didn't sign up to what it was going to do to me. If you take that leap, then I think you could not only build a movement around it, but build a movement with a very clear objective, i.e. cancel this debt, a very radical objective, the same, and a very kind of demotic spirit, where there is something quite kind of hedonistic and delighted about it, you know. So I hold out a lot of hope for that, and I think, and this is huge in the Greens, that they are really clear. This is what they're articulating really clearly, which the mainstream parties cannot articulate, which is a money system based on the extension of credit by private companies will never serve the needs of its people and will always leave them chasing growth to supply the debt which a very small cadre of people have created. And that is why I think the Greens are getting as far as they're getting, is that they found a way to say something which contains its own answer, which nobody else has.
It's utterly discussed, well, in the big debate. Private debt, not discussed.
Oh yeah,
but it's beyond the discursive formation.
But they don't want to talk about private debt. They don't want to talk about asset-backed private debt. They don't want to talk about the extension of credit as a kind of social responsibility or an activity without social responsibility. And they don't want to talk about the need for growth being predicated on completely stupid debt. So obviously that leaves them their hands a bit tied.
I mean, in the States, it is talked about. I mean, and there are examples. I mean, in Argentina, in the last decade, for example, it was talked about. So there are definitely precedents for the politicisation of private debt in that way. I think you're bang on about shame. It's really good.
Oh, and I think you wanted to say something about
quick two quick points. One about that, and then one about them. Does it not work? Go on. Yeah. I think two quick points. One about the debt thing, and then one about why has there not been a digital hegemony coming out of the Labour Party? What's the converse of debt? Well, it's assets. When we talk about the graduate of that future, why are they not more radical despite declining pay? Self-employed have seen real incomes decline by 20% since 2006. And self-employed are a massively growing group, especially since 2010, right? All the outsourcing kind of contracts work on the premise that people who are employed in-house then become self-employed. That's quite common. So what's the converse to this increasingly sort of debt-backed economy? Well, it's asset inheritance. So why aren't young people angry? Because they think, well, I'll have to pay for my education. I'll probably have to pay for my kids' education. I might have to pay for the NHS. I might have to pay for all kinds of things, but there's this inflated asset worth 250k, 300k. I might get some of that. And I think that's what's holding a lot of people back. And if that, I think a lot of people, this isn't really talked about with discussion about the radicalism or lack of it or the presence of it with young people. It's about asset inheritance. And for a lot of people, if that thing didn't exist, they'd be willing to just chuck the baby out of the bathwater, actually. And I think that's why I thought the inheritance tax, nothing's made waves in this election, it's been a non-event. But the inheritance tax move by the Conservatives I thought was a smart idea, and so much you can buy off a lot of young people if you're saying we're going to scrap inheritance tax. And I just want to say,
what they don't realise is how long their parents are going to live.
I know. Of course. But I think there's really rarely talks about asset inheritance in terms of pinning back radicalism amongst young people who are really hit hard by the crisis. And then the second point, why didn't Labour build a digital hegemony? You look at the Democrats. Sorry if I sound like an American fellow. It's like, but this is really what happens in the United States since 2006 is astonishing, both in and outside the Democrat Party. If you look at why the Democrats became so good at digital, it happens here. Are we back?
You're back on that one.
Great. If we look at why the Democrats became so good at digital after 2006, you've got the Howard Dean campaign, the Deaniacs, 2004, the Democrat nomination. He lost it in, was it Iowa? Yeah. Because he thought the mic was off, he started screaming. Anyway, the Deaniacs. So this guy managed to mobilise a lot of young people, very smart, not Democrat Party members. Actually, a lot of people, there's kind of people now joining the Green Party, incidentally. And they were saying, this guy's saying the right things. He was anti-war, had great politics, Vermont governor. So obviously, unsurprisingly progressive. Lots of people went to the Dean campaign. Really elevated expectations, great digital operation. His chief of staff is a guy called Joe Trippi, very good book by Joe Trippi. Check it out, about this whole experience. And then obviously, Dean fails, John Kerry wins the Democrat nomination. So where do those young people go? They started Blue State Digital, which is now the world's most successful digital consultancy. And then Echo Ditto, another very successful digital media consultancy. They turned Dean for America into Democracy for America, which is one of the big organizations that got behind Obama very early doors. You can really trace the failure of the Dean campaign into the Obama campaign. Now, why did that happen? It's because the US has a primary system. It's very open to newcomers, and it's very kind of permeable. Britain's not like that. And the Labour's a very centralised organisation. And so I think the kinds of people that were drawn to Dean in 2004 and then became the backbone of Obama in 2008, don't be surprised if in the next 5 years, those kinds of people are actually joining the SNP and the Greens. And they're going to be building that kind of digital project, I think, because it's not coming from Labour. I mean, their digital stuff
They
is
don't want it.
It's appalling. It's appalling.
They're scared of it, I think. They're scared of it because it kind of entails some delegation of opinion, and they're scared of it.
Well, that's true. I wonder, then you might get another generation, a younger generation who are not. Because one of the things about Labour, I always have to say this about Labour. I mean, anyone even a bit younger than anyone my age or older remembers the 1980s, and they're still terrified of anything that they think reminds them of the 1980s. I mean, they remember, the traumatic experience of that. There was two traumatic experiences of that generation. There was in 1983. People on the left often forget. 1983 going to the country with a radical socialist manifesto for the only time in its history, and almost being completely wiped out. And in 1992, running the best campaign, having everybody in the country say they supported our policies, and then having the Sun say, "Oh, we don't like Kinnock," and then losing. So, and that was really, and rightly or wrongly, I think that trauma is still there. So, I could imagine some of the kind of younger sort of, post-Blairites, people like Stella Creasy, and being less worried about that stuff. I'm not drawing any conclusion from that. I just think they haven't lived through that experience.
Yeah.
Any more questions? We've got one in the front here and one over there. We'll take both.
I just wanted to know, obviously, after the election, the UKIP party and people who feel like that, even in the Labour Party, about immigration and about the EU, they're going to be some kind of a force in Parliament, perhaps for the next 5 years. And there will be a referendum before that 5 years is up. And if the result of that referendum might be that Britain actually leaves the EU, that might be a pretty cataclysmic event so far as the social makeup of the country is concerned. I'd like to know what your views on that would be. Suppose, in fact, Britain left the EU as a result of the present makeup of Parliament. What would be the effect upon the Labour movement?
Thanks. We'll take the other question and then the... Oh, okay, great.
Wow, that's handy. Do you know each other?
Zoe, why don't you start with that?
I don't agree with Anthony King about anything much, but I do agree on one thing about the EU, which is that we could leave and it would be very unlikely that we'd be in a situation stronger than Norway's, and Norway actually weirdly has more kind of undemocratic interference by the EU than everybody else because it doesn't even have any say in it. Just to keep its trade agreements going, it has to abide by EU decisions, which is not even at the table for. So I don't really. It's kind of divided down a left-right line. This. Do you want to be in the EU or out of it? I don't think that's true. I think there are a lot of EU decisions which are not left-wing, which are kind of privatisation-based agendas. So I don't really agree that any right-thinking lefty should want to stay in the EU, but nor do I think that we'll gain a huge amount of national autonomy by leaving it.
Will there be any effect on...
Well, yeah, I mean, it'll be cataclysmic, but I don't think it will... I don't think you could say it's going to go definitely in this direction or definitely in that direction.
Jeremy?
Well, yeah, I don't disagree with any of that, surprisingly. I mean, I don't think there's really any chance of us leaving the EU, because I think if it actually comes on the agenda, the capitalist class in Britain will throw everything at making sure there's a no vote. The capitalist class in Britain wants us in the EU. It's part of we're crucial to the whole project of global neoliberal financialisation. And it's a huge problem. It's the problem of the Conservatives. I mean, Aaron's right. The Conservatives have a huge problem. It's a huge problem that they have a significant section of their traditional base is nationalist, and they are, in class terms, they are committed to a project which is globalist and internationalist in nature. And it may well wreck them. It may well destroy them. But I don't really think there's any chance of it happening. Of course, I mean, if it did, yeah, of course. I mean, if it would only happen. If it does happen, I can only see it happening, as you say, on the basis of a kind of nationalist populist agenda, which is pretty catastrophic. But it's interesting if you watch. It's one of the things I do try and watch quite carefully. If you watch opinion polls on Europe, you know, it's the right's version. It's the right's version of the welfare state and privatisation. You know, people have been saying they're opposed to privatisation. They want higher taxes on the rich. They want, you know, more spending on the welfare state for 30 years, but they keep voting for Tories anyway. And it's the right's version of that. When you ask them when it doesn't look like it's really going to happen, you say, should we leave the EU? They say, oh yeah, we should leave the EU. And then as soon as it starts to come on the agenda, as soon as it looks like they're actually setting a date for a referendum, the polls very quickly start to shift against it. So personally, I don't think there's any real chance of it happening. But I agree about what the consequences would be if it did.
Yeah, I mean the reasonable estimates were giving UKIP 12 seats about a year ago, but now you've got Nate Silver. He called every single state right in 08. I know he got one wrong in 08. I think he got every one right in 2012. He's working with some pollsters in the UK. They're giving UKIP between 1 and 3 seats, probably 1. Which, I mean, you think that's counterintuitive, right? I think Carswell's safe, 10,000 majority. Reckless less so. By-elections are funny things. Farage has said if he doesn't win in Thanet South, he stands down. He looks spent. I mean, he just looks absolutely exhausted. And I think they've probably peaked. They probably peaked in the Europeans last year. Maybe I was thinking that they'd get 12 MPs. That would be awful. Because he's a nightmare in the European Parliament. Imagine in the House of Commons, you know, these kind of grandstanding things. YouTube hits 2 million views. You know, you can imagine, right? I mean, that was a nightmare. But I don't think that's going to come to pass, actually. And my view on it a year ago was this. They'd have 12, 15 MPs. they would successfully frame a referendum on the EU as a referendum on austerity. And I thought the left was going to miss a trick there. They say, look, this is causing wage depression. This is causing cuts to public services. You know, to get rid of that, you need to leave the EU. And I thought that would be quite a close shave. Now, like I said, the polling's not showing that. The organisation's exhausted. On the other hand, they're getting lots of money now, which they weren't getting a year ago. I think what's quite likely after May is that Farage may stand down as leader. I think Carswell will take over. And then that's a very interesting project to the right of the Conservative Party. And that may grow and in a different way, right? So they only really, there's a really great analysis by two scholars, the book on UKIP by two guys from Nottingham.
I was trying to remember the name on the tube on the way over.
Yeah.
It's good though.
Great book. And yeah, Matthew Goodwin. Yeah. And Rob Ford, right? He has, on Twitter, he says Rob Ford Britain, as in not the actor. I don't know Rob Ford. So yeah, Rob Ford and Matthew Goodwin, and they say, look, if you look actually, they do really great discourse analysis on this. You weren't talking about migration until until 2010.
What were they talking about?
It was just Euroscepticism.
Jeez, no wonder they never got anywhere.
Yeah, and
they're weird. Well, Alan Sked thinks he was a leftist.
Yeah,
we're not talking about migration until after 2010.
For what it's worth, I
I
don't think Farage is going to win South Thanet because he's scared to go out. It's really interesting. When he actually goes campaigning, he won't walk down the street because he's too mindful of a negative event. And it's true that one negative event can make a whole campaign look bad, even if everybody loves you. But you don't see Boris Johnson scared to walk down the street. When Boris Johnson goes out, he goes on the train.
But how far do you think? Sorry.
No, it's fine.
The Andrew Marr program where Ed Miliband was asked again and again and again, and he kept on denying it. He doesn't want anything to do with the SNP.
He's being an idiot.
We need to be totally unrealistic to the fact that he will probably have to rely on the SNP, surely.
Of course he'll have to rely on them. Where does he think that? Would he rather not be in government than talk to the SNP? He's being ridiculous.
Well, it sounded terribly idiotic, to people watching it, that he's simply not on. Let me answer this question, and then
I really see them like two divorcees not going to their daughter's wedding. They're like, oh, I'm not going. Of course they're going to go.
But there's loads of things that could transpire. This is what as uneventful as the last month has been, this has really been a non-event with regards to, the election coverage has been completely boring. Compare it to last time, Bullygate, Duffy. Yeah, literally there was a car crash on the day Labour released their manifesto in 2010. There was literally a car crash, and it didn't stop. It was a month-long car crash after that. And this time's just been so boring by comparison. What I think it's going to get interesting is after May 17th, 18th. And you look, I remember I was talking to Richard Reeves, who became the special advisor for Clegg after 2010, and he was going, there's going to be a rainbow coalition. So obviously even Lib Dems were saying this right before the last election. But rainbow Greens, SNP, SDLP, it's a Northern Irish Party. And that was the talk, that was the chat. The Lib Dems are going to get 100 seats. Good nonsense, right? Laughable now. I remember Reeves even saying, he goes, who's the Lib Dem candidate in the 150th target seat? Who knows? And he goes, this was a serious thinker, right? He's the head of Demos, think tank. This time it's going to be very, very different. It's all up in the air. You could genuinely have some kind of agreement, a one-year government, and they'll try and talk about electoral reform. That would buy UKIP, it would buy the Greens, it would buy the SNP. I don't know. And then they may say, we'll go back to the polls. We went to the polls twice in 74. I put some money on that. It was 4-1 a couple of months ago. I think going back to the polls now, given what Miliband said, is more likely than an SNP Labour coalition. You may get confidence in supply for a few months, and doesn't seem that won't work for 5 years. Surely.
What do you think he's going to achieve going back to the polls? That he'll suddenly get all those SNP votes? They're never going to vote Labour again.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't know what they're doing in the SNP. But nobody knows what the SNP is. Like, the SNP don't know what the SNP is.
No.
Yeah, their membership now is a completely different composition from what it was 6 months ago.
Yeah.
The SNP, nobody knows what it is now. There's one reason Ed doesn't know how to relate to it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's more left-wing than Labour.
It is now.
But it's more left-wing. Its membership is more left-wing than its own high command by a mile.
And it's got most of its membership, its new membership, are pro-independence. But I think it's got enough of its members and enough of its voters don't want independence, they want radical devolution, and they want a social democratic bloc in Parliament. There's enough of those. If they withdrew from support for it, it would collapse. I mean, I think we're very likely to see, especially with the implosion of the Scottish Labour Party, we're very likely to see moves for some new party coming out of Scotland. I think some kind of Scottish Social Democratic Party, which will be agnostic on independence.
But I think if we had a progressive left, either if the Labour Party was that, or if we had somebody that wasn't the Labour Party, then they wouldn't necessarily. Most of their arguments for leaving would disappear, right?
Well, they would. I mean, I say that's this is all predicated on Ed being Prime Minister. I think if Cameron stays Prime Minister, I think Scotland is gone in 2 years.
I should have stopped you 5 minutes ago
Yeah,
with
sorry.
a Labour SNP government and near extinction of the UKIP. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to our panellists, Jeremy, Zoe and Aaron. Good luck next week. Good luck for the next 5 years.
Yeah.